Welcome back to another segment of Civil Discourse Now. I'm Mark Small. My co-host Paul Ogden.
Good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon, Paul. We're here discussing residency requirements for elected position and voting. We're coming to you from Indianapolis, Indiana on March 24th, 2012. Our audience is here watching this, and this is the first time we've streamed live, so we have some techno things that we've been dealing with. Our guests today are Matt Stone, who's been a frequent guest on our show, I'm glad to say. He's a former Libertarian Party candidate for City County Council here in Indianapolis. He also blogs on...
Indy Student.
There we go. That's it. Makes it easy. Also with us is Gary Welsh. Gary's a blogger on Advance Indiana. He's also an attorney here in Indianapolis.
We should ask him, too, what kind of law he practices.
What kind of law do you practice? See, I'm open to suggestion.
I consider myself a general practitioner, but I do a lot of immigration law and representing small businesses.
Okay. And we've been discussing, if you're not from Indiana and not from Marion County, well, of course, that doesn't matter anymore. People don't read newspapers as such. You might not know what the local news is, even if you're here from Indiana. Senator Richard Lugar has had questions raised about his eligibility to run for the United States Senate. He's held the office since being elected in 1976, sworn in January 77. So he's served a little under 36 years. There are statutes that address eligibility for voting and eligibility for candidacy. Matt, in terms of the candidacy or the eligibility for voting, what is relevant on that?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, anybody serving in the United States Congress kind of is able to maintain their voting residence whenever they were elected. So if a newly elected congressman decides to uproot his family, go live in D.C., and he can claim either if he's going to keep the house in possession, at least within his family or a close friend or whatever, he can claim that house. It's typical of congressmen across the country to claim a family, a relative's house, a brother, a sister, a grandparent. I know Mitt Romney claims his son's basement in Massachusetts.
He claims 9 other states as his residence, but he's a billionaire, and so there are different values.
But residency requirements generally, and I'm not an attorney, but generally residency requirements are a bit lower of a standard than inhabitancy requirements, to the best of my knowledge. It's similar. I don't like making this comparison, but similar to the military, where you're out somewhere else serving the country, and you come back, you still have that residency.
Wow.
So I think the place where Lugar gets caught up is that the place he was registered at, which is 3500 Highwood Court.
3200 Highwoods Court.
Highwood Court is a home he doesn't own and hasn't owned in over 3 decades. So that's the problem. I know Todd Rokita still lives in his district. Andre Carson still lives in his district. They all have actual residences in there that they could conceivably return to if they ever retire or get unelected from Congress. Richard Lugar, if he returns to Indiana, he does not have a place to lay his head outside of a hotel room.
Well, and here's the thing that bothers me about this. This is a controversy that need not have arisen. Richard Lugar is not poor by any means, because
and that's something that his defenders say. He's a very frugal senator, and he's a very frugal person. But lots of these Congress critters are not extremely wealthy people.
I know, but the thing is,
and are able to maintain 2 residences, one in D.C.
Plus, they get a tax break, correct?
That's correct.
And I think they get some housing money from Congress too.
Yes, but also what I was going to say is this: Richard Lugar owns land in Decatur Township here in Marion County. He owns land. Decatur Township is a blue-collar community,
very rural township.
Richard Lugar could afford to buy a double-wide, plant it down on that farmland in Decatur Township, declare that as his residence, have a barbecue once a year, probably really do a good PR thing for his candidacy. I mean, that'd be huge. And instead, he's dug in his heels for some reason to say, no, I'm going to say that last place where I was residing, that's where I'm going to vote.
And when you ask him why don't you just register at the Decatur farm, he'd be like, well, I don't live there. That wouldn't be truthful. So,
and that's a point that Paul raised in his blog, and that is that by signing that voter's registration and signing the roll when he goes in to vote, Senator Lugar does that under penalties for perjury.
True. However, and Gary can correct me if I'm wrong, when it comes to the election board said,
the county
election board said he was violating the law. However, this is one of the law, and I forget the Latin term, I'm sure you'll remind me. You have to have actual knowledge that you're breaking the law, not just knowledge you're doing the act.
Malum prohibitum as opposed to malum per se.
Exactly.
In English, intent.
And meaning...
Well, type of intent.
It's wrong because we say it's wrong, or wrong because it's inherently or in its essence wrong.
Ignorance of the law is an excuse here. And the election board said that the Attorney General's opinion, said that
there you go, right.
That the constitutional provision, I think there's a statute too that says you don't lose your residency because of your absence when you're on service to the state.
It doesn't only say that. Indiana Code 3-5-5-4 says a person who has a residence in a precinct retains residency in that precinct until the person abandons the residence by having the intent to abandon the residence, having the intent to establish a new residence, and acting as provided in this intent by establishing a residence in a new precinct.
Now, Gary,
but wait a second. Indiana Code 3-5-5-5 says, as provided in Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution of the State of Indiana, a person is not considered to have lost residence in a precinct in Indiana by reason of the person's absence on the business of the State of Indiana or the United States. So it would seem that even though he's left, he would otherwise have abandoned that specific precinct, that he still would be considered he's not considered to have lost or abandoned residence in that precinct. He can't abandon residence, even though anybody else would say he abandoned it. He sold his house. Well, he hasn't, according to the statute.
Well, what are you arguing, Gary, in front of the county election board?
What?
And
it is the breadth of that state constitutional fail-safe provision that protects people from losing their residence while in service of the state or the United States. Now, before we learned that Senator Lugar was claiming the benefit of this fail-safe provision in the state constitution as an excuse for not maintaining a residence in Indiana, to our knowledge, there is no person that represented Indiana in Congress that claimed the benefit of that. It has always been, at least as near as I can ascertain, people who represented Indiana in Congress since the adoption of the 1851 Constitution maintained some residence within Indiana, regardless of what their living arrangements were in Washington while they were in session. Obviously, they do have to spend nowadays the majority of their time in Washington because the Congress is in session almost year-round, not entirely year-round. But at the time of the adoption of the 1851 Constitution, Congress was still a part-time lawmaking body. They spent far more time not in session than in session. And so it would not have even occurred to, in my judgment, if you look at the framers' intent, that they could not have been thinking of members of Congress that they would have been worried about losing their intent. The persons that I think that they were worried about are people who were serving in the military, who got called up for military service and were stationed on a military base somewhere, but still considered themselves residents of the state of Indiana. They didn't want them to lose residence in the state, and it was indefinite as to how long their military service would continue. The same would be true of a person that was elected president, vice president, appointed to a cabinet
And having to
position,
go overseas
or
as
to
an
be an ambassador. Those are full-time positions where they're going to indefinitely be absent from the state, and it wouldn't be fair to deem them no longer residents, even though they're not physically residing within the state.
3 quick points. One, William Henry Harrison was ambassador to, I think, Bolivia or Colombia. He was out of the country. Just getting there took him over a year. Second, in terms of Congress people now, I think that their full-time job, if you look at the balance of the percentage of time that they spend, they're fundraising. That's not really, I mean, that's what they're doing at least 25% of the time, is raising funds for re-election. And third, in terms of anybody having fallen back on this provision before, I look at Dan Coates. Dan Coates is a United States Senator from the state of Indiana now, and was before, and in between he was speaking to a group in North Carolina and was saying something to the effect of, well, I've moved here now, I'm not in Indiana anymore, so he's moved back here to Indiana. But I think this provision, even though we don't necessarily like it, I think it is a savings clause for Lugar, or it would appear to be. I just think it's dumb that he's doing that.
I'd like to know more kind of the PR aspect than the legal aspect. Why he hasn't just done what Evan Bayh has done, what Dan Coates has done, and rent some dumpy apartment on the cheap side of town and just say, yeah, we spend a night or two there a year, or since he has access to the entire state, since he's a senator, you could probably find more affordable housing in smaller towns.
And this issue came up after our case was heard and decided, determining the Marion County Election Board determined by a 2-to-1 party line vote that the Lugars were not legally registered because they had shown an intent to abandon the home by selling it in 1977 and establishing a new residence in McLean, Virginia, and not obtaining any other physical presence for purposes of residing in Indiana from that point on. So that's important to keep that in mind.
And going back in history, this issue actually was raised initially. Richard Lugar ran for United States Senate in 1974 unsuccessfully against Birch Bayh. That's the only major election that he's lost, I believe.
That was a very, very hotly contested race. It was a very negative race. There was a lot of name-calling that went on, and it culminated on Election Day with the Lugar campaign organizing an effort with the local Republicans in Vigo County to challenge Senator Bayh when he showed up to vote at his rural Shirkyville precinct,
and we're at the end
claiming that he no longer resided there. And there was a several-hour standoff, and then he wound up, after they made their point and the press all picked up on it, that he was allowed to vote.
We're at the end of this segment. We'll be back in just a